Will this be enough?
Yes, if you should
I'm not sure I'll be able to do anything else.
please use the microphone because it's...
Okay, sure. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Actually, it's quite a challenge for me to give this talk with my vision science background, but I'll try to do my best. And what I am doing is mostly psychophysics, or the experimental study of human perception and attention using some objective performance measures such as recognition time, reaction time, and so forth. But it seems that some of these methods could be quite useful in the study of the representation of language in the human mind, and mostly in the study of our mental lexicon, or a sort of a dictionary in our memory containing various sources of information such as word meaning, pronunciation, syntactic characteristics, and so forth. There are lots of questions that could be asked about the mental lexicon and its structure. For example, the question how it is organized, how it develops, how it is implemented in our brain, and the issue we were actually addressing is regarding the various grammatical forms of a certain word, because it's actually a question how they are stored there. On the other hand, it's quite possible that all word forms are stored independently. From the point of view of economy, it's not really a good idea. It's probably easier to store just a default form, for example, nominative form, and to derive everything according to the rules of a certain mental grammar. But in this case, we should consider and we should suppose that there is this mental grammar in addition to the mental lexicon as it is, and there are at least three approaches, all of them having its own empirical support. One idea that everything is stored independently, the other idea that everything is stored, but all word forms are organized as a sort of a cluster of interrelated entries, and to activate any of the form you need the activation of the default form or some other form of a word. And finally, there is an idea that there are both this mental dictionary with default lexemes and mental grammar allowing you to produce all necessary word forms. But the situation becomes even a little bit more difficult when we distinguish between two types of morphology. One allowing to produce new lexemes with new meanings. I use Russian examples because that's what we used in our studies. This is derivational morphology, and the resulting word sometimes has nothing to do with the sum of the meanings of separate morphemes, which is not in agreement with the compositional rule. And the other type of morphology then is when you get the same meaning, the same word, but with a new grammatical form, like producing plural or past tense from the present tense or whatever. This is inflectional morphology. So what we decided to study using our psychophysical methods were the following questions. The first one is whether these derived words and word forms are represented in the mental lexicon or constructed there. And the other question is whether the resulting representations are similar or different in derivational morphology and inflectional morphology. And to address these questions, we decided to use the general idea of the information flow in the information processing system. Actually, when we look at this information flow, we suppose that information is somehow introduced or encoded into the system. This is our bottom-up data or stimulus or data-driven stimulus. But to be processed, it requires some comparison with our previous experience or memory or mental lexicon. This is top-down process or conceptually driven process, and as a result we have the perceptual recognition or perceived or understood or conceptualized words or something like this. I'll try to show you how it works, but it's a pity really that I've got this hint to the right. If you can, please try to ignore this part of the screen, as if it is not there at all. So now we fixate across here and try to perceive as many letters as we can. How many letters could you perceive from the first presentation? Okay, 3, 4, 5, yeah. And from the second presentation, which might be as long, you'd perceive everything. That is called the word superiority effect, which means that you recognize letters faster when they are included in the word, and you can report on more letters during the very brief presentation. And the word superiority effect was described as far as in the end of the 19th century by one of the first experimental psychologists and psychophysicists, James Kettle. And what we did, we actually used this idea in our studies, but we used it in quite a strange way. We found a situation where the word superiority becomes a word inferiority. And it is the situation of so-called simultaneity judgments. When you show a word divided into parts and present them successively with a really brief gap, or onset asynchrony, as psychophysicists call it, there is a period when these parts are presented successively, but you still perceive them simultaneously. And for words, this period of subjective simultaneity is longer than for random letters, like this. So you would perceive this as simultaneous for longer durations than something like this. So what we decided to do is to take Russian words, some of them with separable prefixes, and some with separable endings, which refer to derivational and inflectional morphology, and to present them asynchronously, divided either across the root or at the so-called morphemic seam, the location in the word where morphemes connect to each other. And we also compared this to non-word strings, which were constructed of X symbols. So in our experiment, we have had 6 conditions with word split across the root and at the morphemic seam, and with different types of the words. We have had, I guess, 33 subjects, each performing 528 trials, which is quite typical for psychophysics. And the main result was that, of course, you see I'll show it this way. For non-words, we've got this shorter period for subjective simultaneity. Here, the X strings still seem simultaneous with the 8 millisecond gap between 2 parts of the stimulus. And for words, this period of subjective simultaneity is longer. And what's interesting for words split across the root, the period of subjective simultaneity is also longer than for words split across the morpheme. And what's even more interesting when we look at the two types of morphology split at the morphemic seam, the derivational stimuli are still a little bit less simultaneous than words split between the prefix and the root. So not to learn you to read these complicated graphs, I'll just show the general results, which are that for any cross-section, words are perceived as simultaneous, somewhat longer than non-words, which replicates some of our previous results, which have nothing to do with linguistics. Then words split across the root tend to be perceived as simultaneous longer than words split at the morphemic seams. And surprisingly, words split at the seam between the root and the ending seem a bit more simultaneous than words split at the seam between the prefix and the root, which is contrary to our hypothesis because the bond between the prefix and the root should have been stronger as the resulting word produces new meaning. But actually, there are a couple of explanations why this might happen. This may be due to the syllabic structure, because when we use derivational stimuli, they agree, the split agrees with the syllabic structure of the word. But when we use inflectional stimuli, the split does not agree with it. The other thing that has with top-down influences upon visual processing is that prefix always goes first, and the ending always goes last. So the final representation, when we present the ending first and the prefix last, the root last, might be corrected due to this top-down influence as well. So what we decided to do is to try to avoid this confusion, to avoid this influence. And to do this, we search for some other kind of perceptual segregation beyond this temporal segregation of stimuli. Of course, there is spatial segregation, but it is not suitable for prefixes because you can get the preposition and the noun with completely different meanings. So we decided to use so-called feature segregation. When you make this split using different colors. This feature segregation is somewhat similar in its characteristics to spatial segregation, at least. For example, when you use stimuli like this, for example, when I ask you to raise your left hand for A and B and your right hand for C and D and show you letters. So here you try to raise your, yeah? Here. Okay, now. Okay. Now, a little bit difficult. Even a little bit more difficult. Now it's much easier for the central letter, and now as well. So when you separate the flankers from the central letter using either spatial or feature segregation, this makes your information processing easier for the processing of this very stimuli. So in fact, we discovered that a sort of this thing has been done before. For example, Brenda Rapp from Johns Hopkins University tried this sort of things about 20 years ago with derivational morphology and more and less frequent transitions and the morphemic themes. But she didn't compare the split across the root and the split at the seam, and she did not compare derivational and inflectional morphology. So we just repeated our experimental design on this model, but using other performance measures, now reaction time, we had to introduce also some other types of stimuli which provided us with some new data. In the previous experiment, we used the duration of the subjective simultaneity period. Here, we used the lexical decision time. So we asked our subject to decide whether they saw a word or a non-word of the Russian language. So we used words with existing roots and existing prefixes, which refers to derivational morphology, and words with existing endings and existing roots, which is inflectional morphology. These were from the previous experiment. And we also used 4 types of non-words with non-existing root and existing prefix, with non-existing prefix and existing roots, and the same about roots and endings. And we also divided our words and non-words either at the root, existing or not existing, or at the morphemic seam. And we used 2 colors. We varied the sequence of their presentation within every word, and we had 64 subjects. And to show you the preliminary results of this experimental series, the first and the most striking result, and that for all segregation types and all types of stimuli, including both words and pseudo-words, the so-called inflectional stimuli with a root and an ending, either legal or illegal, are classified significantly faster than derivational stimuli. What's also interesting for words with endings, just for words, color segregation across the root, like this, provides faster recognition than color segregation at the morphemic seam. I consider this to be the result of the stronger bonds within the root, which is understandable as compared to the morphemic seam. But for words with prefixes, for derivational morphology, there was no reaction time difference between color segregation either across the root or at the morphemic seam. But we could say, hooray, that's a great result, but actually the thing that was also interesting and not yet interpreted was that words with prefixes were not classified faster than non-words. And we had the error rate for the stimulus type almost the same as for non-words. And actually now we are trying to understand why this happens. So we are running an experiment with no perceptual segregation at all, but with lexical decision on these nouns in the locative case. Actually, we had to use it to somehow make these 2 types of stimuli equal. We could not use nominative in one case and, for example, instrumental in the other case. But it seems that all these guys are definitely not stored in the mental lexicon because the error rate is absolutely tremendous. And the final preliminary result is that with non-word stimuli, for inflectional stimuli, the non-words with non-existing roots are classified as non-words slower than non-words with non-existing endings. This seems quite interesting for me. And for derivational non-word stimuli, still there is no reaction time difference between non-words with non-existing roots and non-words with non-existing prefixes. And still they don't differ from derivational words. The conclusion I can draw from here is that inflectional and derivational morphology behave differently under color segregation, which probably reflects differences in their representation in the mental lexicon. And the very general conclusions of this talk are, first, that psychophysical methods adapted from human visual perception and attention studies might be useful for probing into the mental lexicon. And maybe we should say that it also needs a sort of art of interpretation, but I guess the results are quite interpretable. And the second conclusion is that the methods involving temporal segregation and feature segregation of a noun demonstrate differences in sensitivity in distinguishing between derivational and inflectional morphology. And there should be the third conclusion that derivational and inflectional morphology do differ in our mental lexicon, at least in Russian, but I'll be cautious and I'll let my linguist colleagues to draw this conclusion. And here are the other authors of this talk, Maria, who actually did all technical work and performed all the experiments. Olga, who provided tremendous support in the interpretation of our results, and Ekaterina, who lent us all her experience with temporal order judgments and simultaneity judgment, and also with the statistical analysis. So thank you for your attention, and I'll try to answer questions.
My question is whether the structure of syllables interferes in any way with the morpheme structures you are studying.
Actually, I even mentioned this when discussing the simultaneity judgment data, because this is something we could not avoid anyhow. The stimuli were really thoroughly found and checked with the frequency and letter frequency at the seams and whatever, but there is something like syllable structure we could not cope with. But we tried to avoid this confusion using this color segregation with simultaneous presentation. I don't know whether it worked, but it seems so. Ну, я пыталась, да, но... Actually, I should have said about it. The split was always at the fixation point. So we presented a fixation cross for 1,200 milliseconds, and then we presented a word split at a certain point successively or simultaneously in the second case, but the split exactly at the fixation point, and then it disappeared. And so we asked the question whether the two parts were presented simultaneously, and the second experiment whether it was a word or no word.
When you have difference in prefixes and suffixes, is the number of letters balanced on each side?
Well,
or is the artifact of suffixes being longer or
actually, just a minute, I'll show you this. We did have this artifact because the split was always either 4 plus 2 or 2 plus 4. And in this picture, you see that even for non-words, the blue and the gray lines, we do have difference between 2 plus 4 and 4 plus 2. And this is something I didn't mention, but I didn't put it in the slide. So we can try to compare every sort of displays within it. But we also had to compare somehow the root and ending and a cross root split. So actually it was the really multiple factors analysis of variance. And the things we could talk of with significant differences are all listed here.
Have you looked at this distinction between derivational and inflectional morphology in terms of productivity? I mean, inflectional rules are very productive, but derivational rules, many of them are frozen, so we don't use them. And have you looked at this problem?
Actually, what we could look at our presentation times, like 8 milliseconds difference and like 500 milliseconds total duration are the structure of resulting representation, not the production itself. So that's something which should probably started with some other methods and something, of course, we should think of, but currently I could also speak of whether there is a ready word form in the mind which allows you to make this decision or not. And it seems that for inflectional morphology there is no such form. Still there are still need more studies to be sure about it.
And I have a small question. If I heard correctly, you mentioned that you believe that all word forms are stored independently in our mental lexicon. But what do you think about, for example, Finnish language, where each noun may have more than 2,000 forms and each verb may have more than 10,000 verbs? Do we have still all these word forms in our mental lexicon?
Based on our results, I do not believe that they are stored. I believe that they are constructed. But with derivational morphology, they seem to be stored.
I have a small one. To revisit your strange effect that your prefix derivations took as long as nonce words. The example that you have provided is an opaque derivation. You strip your prefix. The root is not easily semanticized. Vыбор. Is not semanticized. So it may be the effect of the choice of the materials.
Well, actually, the material was really quite limited.